Start. So, good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well and keeping warm and cozy. As ever, it's great to see you all, and those of you with your cameras on, all the more so lovely to see your faces. And as I always say, there's no better way to spend a Monday night than in the company of comrades, coming together to pick apart imperialism and plan for a more peaceful future. And I always love to know where in the world you're joining us from, so do let us know in the chat who you are, which group you're a member of, what you're having for your tea, whatever you like. My name's Shelley. I'll be having stir fry later. I'm the chair of the Stop the War Coalition, and I'll be your chair for tonight's discussion, for which we have a very special guest, and I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Paul Rogers. Paul, it's great to have you again. We last heard from you, didn't we, at our AGM, our annual general meeting back in April, when the war in Ukraine was only 2 months in. And you gave us a very useful assessment of Britain's role, not only in Ukraine, but in the wider world currently, and the need for a radical rethink on security, the discussion was called. So for those of you who don't know Paul, or perhaps a reminder for those of you who do, he is one of the world's leading security experts, Professor of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford. He's authored dozens of books, including Why We're Losing the War on Terror. He's been writing a weekly openDemocracy column on global security for more than 20 years and offering key analysis on the war in Ukraine in recent months. And he's got particular interest in how international conflict shifts and evolve over time. And we've seen a lot of that in these last 7 months, let alone in the last couple of weeks. So it really is good to have you back, Paul, for what tonight has been titled Ukraine, the Cost of War. No, I won't say more about the topic because, Paul, you're going to give us a bit of an introductory talk of around 15 minutes, I think, before we ask some questions and get a bit of a discussion going. So if I can pass over to you to kick us off, please, then the floor, or the screen, I should say, is yours.
That's fine. Thanks so much, Shelley, and thanks so much for inviting me back. I'll limit it to 15 minutes. Just stop me if I'm going on any longer, but I'll try and keep it to that time. And so I thought, because it's back in April since we last had one of these sessions, it would be useful just to sort of take an overview. So it's probably worthwhile just take us back to almost the beginning as to why the war broke out on, what was it, 24th of February. So the background obviously is, why did Putin and Russia go to war? And the background to this, I think, is fairly straightforward. You look at the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 80s, Putin taking over after all the chaos in the 1990s, mainly from essentially an incoherent government, one would have to say. And he, bit by bit, brought a degree of order in his own style. And having come from quite senior ranks of the KGB, that was, if you like, his style. I think the important things to recognize are the nature of the collapse of the Soviet Union and what it did to Russian political thinking about its own position in the world. Now, remember, in the 1990s, Russia was treated with something approaching contempt by certainly Western economists and most Western politicians. This was a failed state, all that was left of a apparently huge sort of unbeatable Cold War opponent. And basically people just saw it as something which had gone terribly awry. It also saw something approaching economic collapse. And remember, middle of the 1990s, Russia essentially had about a third of its entire population of 150 million people below the poverty line. And there was actually quite a major decrease in life expectancy. It was as bad as that. Russia essentially lost what many Russians culturally considered to be the empire. The Soviet Union is viewed in some way like that. And Eastern Europe was known as the Russian near abroad in Moscow. I did several visits to Russia in the closing years of the old system. And you notice that it was already fraying under the Gorbachev period. And essentially when it came apart very quickly. And to put it another way, somebody remarked that after the independence of India, it took about 40 years for the British to lose their empire. And nearly 40 years after that, they still haven't got used to it. So, you know, the Russians, it was about 40 weeks. And so it was pretty grim. Putin was very much of the view that Russia had to be made great again. And that followed a thread of pretty far right thinking in Russia, which goes right back to the 1930s. Probably the most recent exponent of it would be Alexander Dubin, who basically is a kind of guru figure for Putin. And what you saw in the basically the early 2000s, as Russia started to rebuild again pretty strongly, not least because of the higher oil prices, or oil and gas prices. So basically Putin began to rebuild Russia as he saw it as a potential great power again. The one way in which, of course, Russia was a great power was in the nuclear side. One shouldn't really apply nuclear to great, but you know what I mean. That was the one area where they could claim a kind of superpower status. They rebuilt their conventional forces fairly slowly. And even at the start of this war, if you look at the quality and the numbers, they don't compare in strict military terms with what NATO had and has. And of course, NATO is now increasing. The opening area was really to take back full control of Crimea with its hugely important naval port. And essentially that was done really, 7 or 8 years ago. And there were also what you would call encroachments also on two of the basically the areas of eastern Ukraine, which had very large Russian-speaking populations, many of whom, but by no means all, were particularly sympathetic to Russia. You actually had the build-up to the war in what really, I suppose, just 8 or 9 months ago, maybe even 2 years ago. And of course, the breakout came on the 24th of February. The war aims initially were reasonably clear. In fact, Putin spelt them out very much shortly after the start. And that was really to bring Ukraine into the Russian camp, as Belarusia already was, and basically to have two states, one with a large population, a pretty wealthy state, going right up close to the NATO boundaries. Because one of the things that had really angered many Russians of all political opinion was the way in which NATO had encroached on this old near abroad. And that was believed to be something which had not even been planned initially by NATO. And that made it much easier for Putin to say, we have the right to extend our sphere of influence back to where it was before. And the idea, therefore, was to have a very lightning war with the results, the key results achieved within 2 or 3 days, which would involve the very early airborne assault on the airfield, about 20 kilometers northwest of the center of Kyiv, and therefore be able to sort of bring the government to an end, ensure that there was a likely client government, and also take control of the key areas which were most sympathetic to Russia. Obviously, they already had Crimea, and then they had Donetsk and Luhansk as the areas which were already very strongly that direction. In fact, just before the start of the war, Putin had recognized those as parts of Russia. So essentially, the plan was to do things very quickly. And the reality was it failed almost from the start. The initial attempts to take that airfield took 36 hours, not 6 hours. And so the element of surprise was lost. The Ukrainians, probably using American intelligence, were ready for what came next. And within just 48 hours, the whole Russian war plan was thrown astray. Bluntly, Putin and the people around him had massively underestimated the ability of the Ukrainians to respond. Now, that seems extraordinary, but probably worth remembering that the West did this twice 20 years ago. First, Afghanistan, when they thought within a few months the Taliban would go for good, and even more so in Iraq in March 2003, when they believed that the Saddam Hussein regime had been felled within 3 weeks. Remember, 6 weeks after the start of that war, Bush gave his famous mission accomplished speech. So it's not just Russia that makes these sort of mistakes. Much of it came from an outside view of their own capabilities, but also, I think, frankly, a kind of degree of military arrogance that this will be easy to do. By the Sunday after the start, the war started on the Thursday, the 24th of February, and by the Sunday, just 3 days in, Putin gave his speech, which is really worth looking at even now, when he was clearly extremely frustrated with the way the war was going, and warned that if NATO interfered much more, there will be a risk of an escalation of nuclear weapons. And that served as a kind of warning, which I think wasn't taken seriously. Over the next month or so, the Russians withdrew their forces from Kyiv and to the east of Kyiv, right through to towards the second city in Ukraine, which is Kharkiv, but they held on to areas down towards Crimea and tried to expand those. They also were much more prepared to use long-range rockets than the rest to hit targets really right across Ukraine. The Ukrainians very quickly were getting a huge amount of support from the West. And I would argue, I know many people don't quite see it this way, that within about 2 months, certainly 1 month maybe, the war between Ukraine and Russia had also the appearances of a proxy war, in that NATO was giving so much support to Ukraine that it was almost like sort of immersed in it. And that has continued right the way through. Now, the point about this is that in one sense, one has to appreciate this is a rare major international conflict, in that in one sense, neither side can win, but neither side can lose. And what that means simply is that if Russia was really pushed back very hard, then Putin would actually be prepared to at least threaten demonstration nuclear shots with tactical nuclear weapons. But if Ukraine had been really pushed back very hard, then NATO would have really put far more armaments in. And you saw that about 2 months ago, because for a period it seemed to be the Russian ground forces that were making the slow, steady gains. And that was when, in early August, the Americans agreed to pass on to Ukraine these very effective, long-range but highly accurate multiple launch rocket systems known as the HIMARS. There've been a lot of other aid going to Ukraine. There are reported to be, and I'm sure it's right, American intelligence units, including CIA, more or less permanently in Kyiv and probably in some of the other cities. I've no doubt the British have the same, and probably other Western countries too. So this really is a sort of something of a NATO operation. Beyond that, what has happened recently? I don't want to go on too long. How am I doing? Yeah, just 2 or 3 minutes more, because much of the rest can be handled in questions, I'm sure. I suppose what has happened recently is that what has proved to be the case is that the Russian forces have a very low level of morale. I mean, explore those reasons if we want, but it's clear that they're having great difficulty getting the younger soldiers who are combat trained and who have the morale to actually go to war, so to speak. There are certainly very strong supporters of Russia in oblasts like Donetsk and Luhansk and in Crimea, and they are very active in the conflict. But essentially, the Russian armed forces have proved to be very difficult to lead with very low levels of morale. But I'm also have to say that the leadership at the military level has been quite extraordinarily bad too. Now, that means that Russia is having difficulty in holding on to its territory. Putin has taken the decision to annex the 4 oblasts, and essentially that appears to give him a kind of political edge. But of course, the Ukrainians are already controlling part of those areas, and that seems to be increasing at the present time. I think what the Ukrainians are trying to do is to take as much territory as they can before winter sets in. And then the expectation is that the war will be fought at a lower level probably until next March, if there aren't any negotiations. On the Russian side, I think Putin is determined to hang on. And I think what he is doing now is to use the annexations and the nuclear threat as a way of sort of making things difficult for Ukrainians in their relationships, pardon me, with the rest of NATO. I think one has to say that so far that tactic has not worked. NATO, if anything, is more united. The military-industrial complexes in the West are really pretty content with what has happened, because, of course, this means it puts them much more central stage, and bluntly, there's an awful lot of money to be made. That also will apply to other major military-industrial complexes, including in Russia, China, and India as well. So to that extent, this is becoming the era of now thrive the armorers, and that's one of the consequences of the war, even at its present stage. Finally, do I personally think there's a possibility, for what it's worth, just one person, of any kind of negotiated settlement? The blunt answer is we do not know. There are some indications that basically what Putin has been doing is to develop more cards to play in negotiations. And it's certainly true that whatever the Ukrainian government says about not giving an inch, the assumption is that if it came to the crunch, then Ukraine will probably negotiate. And there are all kinds of ways in which, from a diplomatic and even a political angle, there are many different ways out of this once you get really competent mediators at work. But for the moment, it is the unknown. Shelley, let me leave it to that. I've done a full 15 minutes. I know it's really, there's so many things to discuss, but let's do it. Any questions you want to ask, and then discussion generally. I'm in your hands on that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. Really useful introduction there. And I do want to invite anyone who's got questions to have a think about those, post them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them as well. I'm going to kick off with a couple. And interesting that you sort of left it open now on the topic of money to be made. And I want to come to that. But I do want to press you a little bit more on the negotiated settlement. And I know you said the short answer is we don't know, but you talked about Ukraine struggling to hold on to territory. But then in recent weeks, there's been talk of Ukrainian advances, and there's been the threats of nuclear retaliation from Putin. And then, of course, Russia's referendums and the declarations over parts of eastern Ukraine. But then on the other hand, we had the grain export deal, which you described recently as a wedge of pragmatism and possible hope for diplomatic solutions. What do you see as a sort of likely outcome to what's happening right now? Is the war going to end soon, or is it likely to go on for some time? Could I get you to say a little bit more about the possibility of negotiation?
Well, let's put it in a particular way. If we do see the beginnings of a negotiated settlement, I think it is likely to become apparent in the next 6 to 8 weeks. In other words, between now and the end of November. I think it's very likely that things will almost close down, maybe even politically as well, between sort of late November and early March. You can't be sure. And I mean, these are really very uncertain things. You're absolutely right about the grain deal. I mean, as I understand it, there are pretty regular sessions involving the UN, elements of the Turkish government, because the negotiations such as they are take place in Istanbul, Ukraine and Russia. So there are direct negotiations. Also, there are direct negotiations at a much lower level on things like prisoner exchange, and even on getting people out of war zones, with the Red Cross being extremely good in the latter, and the UN doing its, rarely lauded work on the former. So yes, things are happening, and that means that there are always possibilities of more. The point is with this, that this is the kind of situation, and you see it in many examples of major conflict, where there are the very tentative feelers. We saw it even in Northern Ireland. The British government, even under Thatcher, was saying, we will never deal with terrorists, but they were putting out their feelers when things got difficult. And essentially what happens there is now I'm not an expert at all in negotiations. I should have said at the start, I'm not a country expert on Ukraine. I try to do comparative work on different kinds of conflicts, so please remember that. But on this issue, you have what are known as track 2 negotiations. And this is where each party to a conflict may be prepared to see people who support it talk informally with people on the other side. And now the thing about this is these people may be quite experienced, they may have very good contacts, and they may actually be able to talk quite seriously with their opposite numbers, but they are not official. I've been involved loosely in 1 or 2 of these, basically involving Iran and the United States, and could see how it was done. Now, there are indications, I wouldn't put it strongly than this, that some Western countries aren't too keen at present to see those sorts of negotiations. There are even claims, you may remember, not really denied back in March, that the Russians and the Ukrainians might have been prepared to do a deal, and essentially it was Western countries who showed they were not willing to do so. And this, I think, is one of the issues that I haven't mentioned before, and that is the feeling in, let me call them, the rather hawkish elements, particularly in the United States, but in some European countries, including Britain, that basically let this war carry on for at least another year and wear down the Russians and do more and more damage to their economy. Now, that seems an extremely grim, cynical thing to say, but you have to remember that, strategic people on the hawkish side will be looking long term. And what they see is not a multipolar world yet, but the possibility of a multipolar world with one of the biggest poles, if I can use a multipolar system, being China, allied to Russia. And what they want to see is one component, that potential superopponent, actually damaged as much as possible. Now that I think is true. I would accept that that is happening. On the Ukrainian side, there will be many people in Ukraine who will be under pressure not to negotiate yet, because at the moment they do seem to be on something of a winning program, not least because of all the help from the West. I should just add one thing to this. And yes, Ukraine has been getting huge help in handheld anti-aircraft missiles, anti-radar missiles for their own interceptors and the rest. And the HIMARS thing has been particularly effective. If I remember rightly, that has a range of something like 80 kilometers, about 50 miles. The Americans do have a longer range thing, the ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, which has a range of, I think, 150 kilometers. That's what, more than 100 miles. Now, the point is, if they provided that to the Ukrainians, the Ukraine army would be able to target areas deep within the currently occupied territories, including probably the whole of Crimea. Biden has not long gone along with that. There are people on his right in the Congress who want him to. There's certainly people in Ukraine. But what it does mean is that to some extent, although the war is being fought by the Ukrainians, the tempo and the rate of the war is partly to be decided by NATO. And so really, NATO actually has a bigger role in, I think, probably even determining the possibility of negotiations than we realized at the time. Now, again, all this is quite tentative. It doesn't answer your question directly, but there are groups on both sides who see that it would be advisable to go for a settlement. There are plenty of people in the West, including many professional mediators, who say, give us the chance to do this and we can do something. And there are certainly people in Russia, I think increasingly, who see that what Putin has done has been basically a series of grievous errors, and Russia has to get out of this. It's not unsimilar to where Gorbachev found himself. He came in 1985. Russia was already being, well, the Soviet Union as it was then, was facing the terrible war in Afghanistan. And by 1986, early 1987, Gorbachev accepted his own experts' advice that they had to withdraw. Putin is not in Gorbachev's position. He has a very different attitude to life, but there are the other people around him who will be receptive to that kind of message. So there's always scope for optimism, but I'm afraid I have to repeat what I said at the start. I don't know how it's going to end, and I think very few people really want to take a guess at that, I'm afraid, at present.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Now, I've had a few questions come in the chat as well. Brendan asks simply, what should the UK government be doing? Thomas asks, do we know if support to Ukraine is a gift, or are these loans or an expectation of something else? They kind of tie in with what I wanted to ask next on military spending. So you talked about the weapons that are going in and then this being, very much a NATO operation in that regard. NATO countries are already increasing their defence spending. We're seeing an even bigger boost in Britain's military budget. Is that likely, do you think, to be followed by other countries? And what are the consequences of that spending decision, coupled with the existing economic consequences of the war itself?
Well, I mean, in the case of Britain, if the Conservatives really did go through on what they're saying, then we're talking about, 40 to 50% increase in defence spending, when we're already one of the heaviest spenders in the world. People tend to forget this. Germany has plans for even bigger expenditure, which I think will put it third in the world after the United States and China. So you would have Germany plus 4 other countries pretty close, Russia, Britain, and India. And so you have those 6 countries with the Americans way out in front, China well ahead of all the others, but then those 4 clustered together, all of them almost certainly increasing the defense spending. That also has the effect of, in a sense, increasing the influence of the various defense lobbies. And you see in Britain, the major defense countries or military companies, call them companies, call them what you will, wanting to lobby even more intensely. And I'm sure an awful lot of lobbying is going on quite blatantly at times, but certainly behind the scenes, because war, bluntly, is good for business in the short term. I mean, I think as people like Scylla Elworthy has shown, peace is actually better for business. But essentially, in the short term, for the companies concerned, it's good for business. And you will see already, increased demand for the HIMARS artillery rocket system by other countries, and that's already happening. So the military thing is one of the worst things that come out of this war. but it's almost unstoppable in the short term. As far as what were the other ones, Shelley? I've just lost my train of thought. There were a couple of other questions related to that.
Yeah, so what should the British government be doing? And do we know if support to Ukraine is a gift, or is there kind of something expected out of them?
I think most of the support is in the form of direct grants and gifts. I think a lot of the weapons are going on in which there is support offered from the United States. The Ukraine is also looking to buy weapons as well, so it's a bit of a mixture. But most of it is actually done by Western states who see this as part of a means of getting under control, so to speak, a country which they regard as an enemy. I say a country they regard as an enemy. It's worth remembering, we must always remember, there are probably millions of Russians who are against this war. I mean, something like 200,000 had left before this recent draft, another 200,000 have left since. Now, that basically is a heck of a lot of Russians. There are 400,000 largely men have left. That's a huge number of Russians who basically are put in the position of often losing their major breadwinner. And I think there are many, many, many Russians. We have Russian relatives who will tell you a very different story to that which gets out into the media. So we must always remember that it's so easy for countries to basically vilify a country and all the people. I'd like to see a real decrease in the rhetoric from the British government. I'd like to see much more aid given to Ukrainians who have to leave Ukraine, and indeed Russians who have to leave Russia. And I mean, we really need to support the very brave pacifists who are still trying to operate in Ukraine. I think the British government does have very good diplomats, not as many as it did, because over the last 12 years, the Tories have basically cut down the expenditure on diplomacy. But we have people who could contribute. We have people who know a huge amount about Russia, and we have very good links. The British government, I think, in its current complexion, the Conservative government, is particularly likes the idea of a strong military. It's part of making Britain great again globally. And that, I think, is the problem. It's not very much helped by the pretty dire defence policy of the Labour Party, which almost seems to be vying with it from time to time. So I would like to see a very different policy, a very different attitude from the British government. But there's not any immediate possibility of that, I'm afraid to say.
No, it doesn't look like it. Thanks, Paul. Ian in the chat asks, how seriously should we take the nuclear threat from Putin? And I kind of wanted to pick up on this as well. What do you make of the prospects and dangers of potential nuclear war? You talked earlier about the first use policy. You know, is it a serious threat, and can it be avoided? And if so, how?
Well, the first thing to say is that any kind of crisis involving more than one nuclear power, then a particular thing you always have to remember, it applies to any crisis, and it goes by the acronym AIM, A-I-M, and that stands for accidents, incidents, and mavericks. And when you think about it, these are the kinds of circumstances which can push a crisis through to something far worse. And I think this is particularly true when you have, well, one clear nuclear power against a nuclear alliance. The second thing to say, and I won't go on too long about this, because I think CND is organizing a webinar in about a month's time on tactical nuclear warfare. The second thing one has to say is that it seems quite extraordinary that Putin could even talk this way. But, you know, probably quite a few of us involved tonight who can remember the 1980s, when NATO had its policy of flexible response, which involved first use. It goes right back to, what was it, Military Communication 43, in I think it was April 1968. So it's been around for, you know, well over 50 years. And that is a policy in which it envisages essentially the use of tactical nuclear weapons early on if the alliance or a member of the alliance is losing a conventional war. I'll illustrate this if you like. I think it's about 1985, NATO was actually quite keen to sort of tell people what its policy was, particularly people who might have a professional interest. And I was invited along with other international relations academics and a few others to actually have a briefing at NATO headquarters. They did it fairly regularly. They actually had C&D groups going one time. But essentially, I remember getting the briefing on NATO tactical use, and I had a chat with one of the senior German civil servants attached to the NATO nuclear planning group over coffee, just a sort of a talk like that. And I asked him, well, you're talking about demonstration strikes. What do you mean? Well, he said, if we were finding that we were caught by surprise attack and the Soviet military were pouring through the Fulda Gap and basically threatening a large part of Germany, what we would have the option of doing then is to fire off up to 5 very low yield nuclear weapons in the upper atmosphere. It might blind some people. It would certainly muck up the electronics of many areas, but it wouldn't be a lethal thing in the short term in terms of killing people. But it would show the West that we mean, the East that we mean business. I said to him, do you think that's controllable? And he said, oh, yes. And so if you transfer that to Putin, he sees the possibility, for example, of threatening some kind of small tactical nuclear strike to show he means business. The problem is what happens once that has been done. But I think one has to realize that that kind of policy probably exists for every nuclear power, all 9 of them. And it certainly exists for Britain. I mean, we had, I think, what, 18 months, nearly 2 years ago, we had the Conservative defense policy come out. And on the nuclear side, that included an increase in nuclear warhead numbers, ceasing any further information about the nature of the warheads in terms of their makeup or numbers, and basically closing up of things, and also a willingness to consider nuclear use in response to, what was it, biological, chemical, and even cyber attacks. In other words, non-nuclear. And that was the Tory thing. Very few people realize that, I'm afraid. If people are interested, I think both Kate Hudson of CND and I have done short things for Declassified UK. I did do a longer piece about 18 months ago for Rethinking Security, and I'll put a link in chat just now. And that was an article specifically about Britain. But it's a different world to what people think. Nuclear weapons have never just been about mutually assured destruction. And this is why you have to bear this in mind once you get people like Putin talking about the possibility of even demonstration nuclear use. It doesn't mean it's near, I don't think it is, but it means that it reinforces the demand that so many countries have now, and millions of people, that we should be involved in really getting rid of nuclear weapons. We should be moving towards a nuclear-free world. One other very quick thing is that at the end of the Cold War, in the very early 1990s, some of the world's leading hawks, you might say, began to talk about the need for a nuclear-free world. And that included General Lee Butler, who was the actual head of the US Strategic Command. So in other words, he was probably the leading nuclear person in the United States, and he went non-nuclear in his retirement. So, it's more complicated than we think, but I'm afraid, people have lost the knowledge of this, or forgotten, or would never knew the knowledge of this over the last 30 years, which is why it's so important that groups like CND are promoting it.
Thanks, Paul. I've got a couple of hands up as well, so I'd like to invite Tom and then Lindsay to come in and ask them on screen if they feel happy to do that. So Tom Cuthbert, just inviting you to unmute, comrade.
Hi, Paul.
Hello, hi.
Really, this goes back to one of the points that you made before. It's about arms deals. Now, I seem to remember in October of 2021, Ben Wallace went to Ukraine to conclude a naval deal for small ships. Now, this was almost them being complicit in some kind of future conflict. What has happened to that deal? Because the Russians have pretty much captured a lot of that coastal area. The Brits financed a deal of about $1.5 billion to Ukraine, and apparently Scottish shipyards may be building those ships. What is going to happen to that? I mean, it seems a huge waste of money, and yet it's sort of forgotten,
Tom, I don't know, I'm afraid. I'm just not up to date on that. My guess is that in some way it probably is going ahead. And as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, they think eventually they will be able to at least win the war sufficiently to take back most of the coastline. And they will, their navy will be looking to the future, having been decimated in the first, 3 or 4 days of the war. But I can't answer it, I'm afraid.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you.
If I could ask Lindsay as well to ask your question.
Thanks, Shelley. Hi, Paul. Thanks very much for all these very, very interesting points that you've raised. I just wanted to ask perhaps some of the political ramifications here, because I think one of the issues with both Putin and with Ukraine, presumably, even if they want to negotiate, then there are all sorts of people in their respective countries who are saying, don't do this, and that we have to keep fighting. And it seems to me as well that the recent setbacks for Russia in the war are causing a lot of problems for Putin at home, not least the resurgence of an anti-war movement there, which is very important. So I'd just like your comments on that, but also how that really, to ask you about a political overview about practically everywhere, I suppose, but also thinking about our own government and the complete mess it's got itself into economically at the moment. And of course, one of the things they're very much reinforcing is this whole question, you know, if you hear Liz Truss, it's all Putin's fault, everything, you know, the energy prices, which of course were rising before the war started, all sorts of other questions. They are very keen to kind of, you know, say we've got to spend far more money on defence, and they're talking about 3%, and they're talking about really effectively doubling defence spending by 2030. So just wonder how you feel about some of these political questions and where you think they might be going in terms of the outcome of the war, I suppose.
I suppose as far as Britain is concerned, the British government is in all sorts of trouble at present. And when a government is in trouble, if there happens to be a war or a threat of war handy, then it fulfills a purpose, to be blunt about it. I mean, you saw Thatcher took massive risks at the time of the Falklands-Malvinas War, but they paid off handsomely for her. And certainly the 1983 election was won far easier than otherwise would have happened. I know Labour had a lot of differences, but basically it was almost a war, an election-winning policy. Now, you can't say that that was the reason for the war, but what you can say is that people will learn from that. So essentially, a country like Britain, which has a government which believes that Britain can be great again by being a military power, essentially will be looking to this as a way of showing that it is a major military power. And certainly diverting from all the domestic attention is, in their view, very important. So I think one has to factor that in, whether you like it or not. On the wider issue, we're missing out on being two huge components. What is the attitude of the global South, and what in particular is the attitude of China? One of the things you noticed in the first couple of months of the war was that Western governments held together pretty strongly in their more or less universal condemnation of Russia. Global South governments, many did, but many didn't, and many of their populations took a much more sort of ambivalent view. And for them, it was much more a question of, I suppose, a plague on both your houses. There was precious little support for Russia, but there was precious little support for the West. Now, why was this? Well, obviously, many countries in and around the Middle East have been on the receiving end of the Western wars of the last 20 years, you know, particularly Iraq, Libya, Syria, and many others. But wider, many countries across the global South had within lifetimes experienced basically colonization, well, the end of colonization. They'd remembered their own experiences when being colonized. So their attitude to the Western countries was not as sympathetic as many people expected. As far as China is concerned, Xi Jinping essentially sees China as, you know, a world great power. Doesn't mean that it sees itself as the global superpower. In some ways, China has moved beyond that. You see it much more in cultural terms. The Chinese are not massively expanding their military forces. They're spending as much money, if not more, on all kinds of industrial developments. But essentially for Xi Jinping, having Russia as a kind of ally is good, which means that the war is not going well from his point of view. It is also the case that Xi Jinping is probably the only world leader who actually has a position where he could more or less, if not enforce, then go a very long way to ensuring that the Russians do come to the table. So I wouldn't rule that out. Things could change really very quickly. But in the shorter term, I think we're stuck more or less where we are. But we have to remember this global situation. I mean, one other thing, if I might say, which I think is worth remembering always, is that this war has been on our screens for the first couple of months. It's 24/7. And the belief was that this was an unusually bitter war with the Russians doing unusually brutal tactics. It wasn't. It was certainly brutal. It was certainly vicious. But the reality is this is much more like modern warfare is. What we were seeing it was actually almost secondhand because of the very extensive coverage. But, you know, if you've been watching the Arabic version of Al Jazeera during the Iraq war, one of my Arab friends told me, you'll get a very different picture from what came out on the Al Jazeera English language version. You would be seeing in much more brutal reality what was happening to people. It's true that some of the Ukrainian cities have been absolutely leveled. But, you know, what about Fallujah in November 2004, where, what was it, every building of every public building was destroyed or severely damaged, and half of all the housing stock was severely damaged or destroyed. And that was by the US Marines. So essentially, and of course, we more or less destroyed the western part of the old city of Mosul, not that long after, well, more recent past. So it is not just an unusual war with the Russians being particularly brutal. There have been huge brutalities and huge war crimes, but this, I'm afraid, is more the nature of current war, and one of the other reasons why one has to work against it as much as one can.
Thanks a lot, Paul. We've got a bit more time for some more questions. I just want to quickly use this opportunity to plug a few things. So some of my colleagues have been posting in the chat about our 2022 appeal. A lot of what we do as a coalition costs money, our protest meetings, lots of other activities, and we rely on your kind donations as well as your membership subscriptions. If you are able to donate a little bit of money, that would go a long way. So please give generously if you're able to. Another plug is for our best-selling NATO pamphlet. If you want to know more about the history of the War Coalition, it's a £5. You can get it online, and it will make a great gift if you want to get a couple for your friends and family as well. And then finally, a couple of events coming up, and I do apologise to the comrades who are further afield. I know we've got people in Canada and Germany and all over the world calling in tonight, but they are both in London. One of them is taking place this Saturday, and it's the Free Assange campaign has organised a human chain which is going to circle around Parliament and elsewhere in Westminster, calling to not to extradite Assange. That's lunchtime on Saturday in London. And then on the 18th of October, really excited about this, we're doing a special screening of John Pilger's new film, A Coming War on China, and he's going to be coming along to do a Q&A afterwards as well. So that's the evening of Tuesday, the 18th of October, if you're able to come along. Now, on the topic of China, I've got a question here in the chat from Sweater. Now, Paul, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to do a bundle of questions just so we can try and fit as many in as possible.
Sure, yeah.
So Sweater asks, regarding China's position on the war, what lies ahead for China and US relations and its implication on the Indo-Pacific region? You got that?
Yep.
Excellent. I've got another one here from Anne. Is there a world leader or leaders that you think could lead negotiated peace talks in the conflict? And then I've got another one here from Maya in the chat, which is, what are your thoughts on the recent Nord Stream gas pipeline explosions and how they may affect the trajectory of the war?
Right.
Back to you, Paul.
Well, on the first one, China, I mean, quite separate from the Ukraine war, what has been happening in relations between the United States and China is that elements within the United States, and probably many US politicians, do see China as the lead competitor, if not rival, to the United States. The United States still considers, by and large, that it is the world superpower. And bluntly, you can say the combination of military and economic power probably means that is true. But China is coming up very quickly on this. And so there is this sense in China, in the United States, that just as many years ago, Europe was seen as its sort of extra territory facing the Soviet Union, now it is China having more and more influence across the Indo-Pacific region. And so you have this sort of view within the United States, pretty widespread, that you must, quote, stand up to China. And this is reflected in the changes in positioning of ships, in some of the equipment that they're now getting. It doesn't mean the United States has, quote, pulled out of Europe, because the United States, I can't remember the figure, it certainly has bases in something like 120, 130 countries. It is very much sort of positioning itself globally, and still is. Many people who look at it economically say it is grotesquely overreaching itself, but be that as it may, that is its attitude. So I think as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, it's another reason why the Americans, even though they are much more, and when I say Americans, the people who look this way, again, many Americans don't look this way. We always have to remember that. But many people sort of more or less on the right, on the United States side, see the Russian war in Ukraine as a good opportunity, as we were talking about earlier on, of weakening Russia. And that sort of, in a sense, plays into their own view of limiting China's power. On the negotiations, I don't see that you would get a world leader leading negotiations. That is not how the UN works. What you would see, and what you've already seen, for example, in those grain negotiations, is really skilled UN diplomats, sometimes seconded from other countries, helping with the negotiations or even facilitating them. And so what I think you would see would be, you know, not necessarily world leaders, but people who have the trust of real sort of serious, wise politicians. There are a few around who would be really particularly significant. You might then get some sort of figurehead figure. That would probably be the Secretary General, frankly. But I don't necessarily see that you have sort of a major individual world leader who would play the lead on this. It's possible that there might be a presidential election in the States in a couple of years' time who brings somebody to the White House with the status of Roosevelt in his later years. But at the same time, I don't see that in the short term. Nord Stream, we simply don't know. If, as is possible, it is actually a Russian sort of sabotage attack, if you like, then it would basically serve the purpose of reminding people of the other forms of unconventional war. And of course, there are so many, particularly on the cyber side and many other sides, working both ways. We always have an assumption that it's the bad people who do it to us. Well, we're very ready to do it and have done historically on many different occasions. But so it could well be part of what is called this new kind or renewed kind of hybrid warfare that we're seeing.
Imagine if we're the bad people, Paul.
Well, this is the point, you know, the whole thing is good is and bad is, and that is so crass as a sort of a simplification. It's something I think you just have to avoid, but you see the way it is being put around all the time on both sides. It's always on both sides, and that is where the people in the middle often take the opprobrium for both sides, but that's part of their job.
I thought I'd done my announcements, but Phil Fight the Power Taylor has reminded me that there is a trade union conference. For those of you that are active in your unions, Glasgow Stop the War is organising a trade union conference on the 29th of October. We also have a national trade union conference on the 21st of January. So if you are in a union, get your branch affiliated to Stop the War and come along to either or both of those conferences. I've got a couple more interesting questions from comrades who put their hands up. So if I can just come to those as probably the last ones, I'm afraid. But first of all, I've got Jan, and then I've got Diana and Nick. Jan, just asking you to unmute.
Yes,
there we go.
Unmuted. Okay. How much do you think that the markets are behind this, and that current aggressive neoliberalism is the driving force in this war, and how can we educate about that? And the other one, not quite related, but do you think the border, the eastern area annexations or elections are Putin's way out, or an attempt as a way out? Not quite related, but
well, Jan, in reverse order.
If I could just get Diana and Nick in as
sure,
well,
yeah.
just to squeeze them all in. Thank you. Now, Diana and Nick, I can't hear you. You're not muted, but seems to be some sort of issue with the sound. If you want to type your question in the chat, I could possibly read it out. Sorry for that. Paul, maybe go ahead and come back to Jan.
Okay, fine.
Thank you.
Jan, if I can take them in reverse order, I think it's actually an optimistic view is that actually Putin's decision to annex those 4 oblasts is actually to have a card in his hands for negotiations. It's certainly possible, but it's very difficult to tell. You know, you look at some of the really good analysts of Russian politics, and they're saying at the moment, as far as we can tell, Putin still believes he could win. There are probably elements around him, perhaps some getting even a bit of influence, who are pointing out this huge damage that's being done. So I think one's got to be very cautious about assuming that, you know, one reading is that this is actually a ploy to help with his negotiations from a rare position of strength in an area where, in fact, if anything, Russia is in a much weaker position than sort of 3 or 4 months ago. On the issue of the neoliberalism, well, I don't think the connection there is direct. Certainly, I mean, I think that we have 2 global problems without question. That is the widening wealth poverty divide with marginalization of billions of people, and also, of course, climate breakdown. You put those together and we have a heck of a problem. As far as the neoliberal sort of market fundamentalism angle, I think the connection with this is that war is good for business, and that has a powerful element. But I think more generally, what we're playing with here is a neoliberal outlook, which may be benefiting from this. But the real problem with that whole model is it cannot cope with climate breakdown. It's at root, I mean, I think it's a very dangerous system. You know, we've had it 40 years, and we're now in this issue of this era of runaway wealth, which is becoming grotesque. You know, the report from Credit Suisse only last week, you know, one of the world's leading banks in this sort of field. If I remember rightly, the ultra high net worth individuals, that's the really rich people who have $50 million equivalent of wealth. And I think if you remember, you don't quote me on this, I think there are now over 200 of them, 200,000 of them. They increased their wealth last year by an average of 20%, increased it by 20%. And the same has happened in Britain as well. So you have this whole era of runaway wealth. And in a sense, I think a war type economy can make this rather easier for people to, certain sorts of people in certain sorts of trade, to make money. But I have to say, and this is the thing we can't touch tonight, but the much greater security facing the entire world is, of course, climate breakdown. You put the 2 together, a divided world, which is also a constrained world, and that is what we really have to work towards preventing getting any worse. Maybe on the environmental side, people are at last waking up. I have to say that on the economic side, we still have a very long way to go.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Paul. Then that was the question that Diana and Nick had wanted to ask as well, about the impact of war on the climate and the ecological crisis. We know obviously war has an enormous
I can add to that a bit.
Great.
Scientists for Global Responsibility, Stuart Parkinson, they've done some very good publications on the output of greenhouse gases by the war machines, and it's pretty heavy. If I remember rightly, the American military have an ordinary output, and this is not in time of war, at least equivalent to the entire output from Portugal and maybe even bigger countries. But the other problem, I think, and I do lecture regularly at defence colleges, is that in defence thinking, the role of somebody in the British military is to defend the realm from future threats. Now, you can say that's perfectly reasonable from the point of view, but the trouble is that is not trying to address the reasons why future threats might arise. And so the military often are very well aware of the problems of climate breakdown and how they would have to try and sort out the mess by protecting the country. But by and large, they don't see it as their role, to use the Quaker phrase, speak truth to power to the politicians and say, if you don't sort out the cause of climate breakdown, we're not going to be able to protect you. So that jump has to be made from within the military. And by and large, it's not being made at the present time. But at least you can talk to senior military about this, and they do get the point, but it's not being shown through in changing their attitude. Now, I got a little bit off camp on that one, but that basically, I think, it's a useful pointer to remember.
Thanks a lot, Paul. There's a couple of people have asked about the media. Liz said, how far can we trust info coming from either Western or Russian media? Doug and Marie asked for a few remarks on mainstream media distortions. Of course, you can trust what you read by Paul on Open Democracy. And if you're not already reading his weekly column on there, I really recommend it, because it really is excellent analysis on what's going on in this war, but also more widely in politics. Paul, have you got any other sort of points to make on media?
We're in a particular position in Britain because much of the media orientation is dominated by three particularly large media groups, basically three billionaire families, essentially the Daily Mail people, the Barclay brothers, and of course the Murdochs. And so they do tend to set the agenda quite a lot. That is for the print media, which affects the broadcast media as well. That makes reality difficulty. You have some independence there, but not very much. Where, of course, you do have a lot more independence is with some of the other social media. I mean, I'm a big fan of open democracy. I think some of the work being done by the Rethinking Security group are very interesting. Some of their stuff they're publishing, they're actually running an alternative security review for the UK. And that, I think, has actually got some quite decent funding for it. You look at groups like Byline Times, obviously Declassified UK, which is doing extraordinary investigative journalism, and you know, I think is getting the British government in some sources really very annoyed because it's uncovering so many things. And there's some very good individual commentators, George Monbiot and many others, but essentially it is much more on not the underground side, but on the alternative side. But there's no lack of good material out there, and all these groups need support just to sort of thrive more. But they're very determined. I mean, I find the monthly Byline Times, which is 30 odd pages of pretty good quality stuff with no advert, always worth a read. For that 36 pages for £3 a month, it's worth anybody's money, I would say.
Thanks, Paul. And for the same amount of money, you can keep Stop the War Coalition going with a monthly subscription. So that's a great note to end on. I would just like to remind anyone who isn't a member to please join. And if you can afford to donate, please do to our annual appeal. It's been fantastic having you, Paul. And it's been fantastic having, I think we had over 200 people on the call tonight. Really lovely to see you all. And I hope to see you again very soon.
Let's hope we can talk again in happier times.
Absolutely. For a more peaceful future. Take care, comrades. Good night. Enjoy your tea.